The ocean murmured like a half-forgotten lullaby as Kayla Reese leaned over a sun-warmed planter box, coaxing a stubborn orchid bud from its moody slumber. Her fingers, delicate and slow, moved like she was painting silence into the soil. The morning air smelled of salt, citrus, and mild dread, though that last bit was likely just intuition. Behind her, a seagull screamed at the void, as if it too had just remembered something it shouldn't have. Then came the thud. Not loud. Just final. A soft pressure against the front door. A box, unmarked, humming faintly, not with power, but with memory. Kayla didn't sigh out loud. She exhaled like a glacier finally letting go of an ancient crack. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands. It was warm, familiar. A single envelope clung to its side like a bad idea that had gone to finishing school. She peeled it open. Inside, matte black paper, a sentence etched in thermal ink that seemed to rearrange itself between glances. Begin again. There was no sender listed. There didn't need to be. Kayla knew the feel of obligation disguised as destiny. She stood for a moment, still barefoot, dirt on her hands, and said nothing. She just walked to the kitchen, rinsed her palms, and poured tea. Chrysanthemum, ironic and intentional. Across the stars, the Krylax Imperium's high assembly chamber, more cathedral than conference hall, swelled with ritual importance and delusions of grandeur. Crystal glyphs rotated in slow orbits, pulsing with bureaucratic indignation. Emperor Kairos, embedded with 17 ceremonial gemstones and not a single working doubt, stood on his dais of judgment. "We offered trade," he intoned. "We offered integration. We offered mercy. And what did we receive?" Strategist Noel, antennae twitching with irritation, tried to avoid eye contact with the holographic remains of their last ambassador, now preserved inside what seemed to be an Earth tuna can, rebranded as Imperial Soup with a handwritten sticky note. "Sorry, we're closed. Leave a message next century." Noel cleared his throat, or the insectoid equivalent. "Emperor, Earth refuses to acknowledge our authority. Their culture redirects intention. Our influence evaporates upon contact. Then we remove the two." "Culture," Kairos snarled. "Activate Oblivion Protocol." There was a pause, even among those who breathed through gills and algorithms. "Sire," Noel ventured, "that protocol hasn't been touched in—" "She is still alive," the Emperor said, eyes glittering. "The sleeper, the human designated as Agent Foxglove. Eliminate her, and the rest will collapse like myth in sunlight." Back on Earth, Kayla adjusted her sun hat and snipped a dead stem with the kind of finality that usually preceded regime change. The birds kept singing. She didn't need to check the sky. She could feel it, a ripple of arrogance moving faster than light. The first assassin arrived just after sunset, quiet, cloaked, engineered perfection. His entrance was a minor miracle of geometry and menace. He did not leave. Surveillance footage from the area showed nothing but static and the faint hum of wind chimes that hadn't been installed yet. When a retrieval drone arrived, it found a piece of haiku etched onto a stone. Beneath orchid roots, silence sharpens intention, death forgets to breathe. Noel stared at the scan in stunned revulsion. "She's bending the context," he muttered. She turned a gravity spear into a wind chime. Kairos dismissed the report with a snort. "Send another, then 7. No human is beyond pattern saturation." Earth's response was maddening. No counterattacks, no declarations, no shields raised. Just Kayla, drinking tea on her veranda, flipping through a gardening catalog, and apparently whispering coded instructions into her begonias. The assassins didn't just fail. They vanished. Everyone. Replaced by scattered verse, broken weapons turned into harmless decor, and an odd uptick in local jazz frequencies. Kayla kept her expression calm, but her movements grew slower, more meditative. She repainted her mailbox, not red, not blue, a color so neutral it became terrifying. When the seventh assassin's remains were returned to the Krylax Empire, via a hologram that played footage of him repeatedly slipping on a rake that wasn't there, Kiros lost his ceremonial patience. "She's mocking us." Noel didn't respond. He was too busy decoding the haiku that referenced his childhood dreams. Meanwhile, Dr. Rina Velasquez, sipping her third latte of the day from an unbranded thermos at Earth's unofficial command hub, also a laundromat, watched Kayla's garden through 8 satellites and 3 weather balloons. She nodded once, adjusted the traffic light patterns in Kyoto, and smiled faintly. "Nap time's definitely over," she murmured. Across Earth, wind patterns shifted a fraction, unnoticed. But in orbit, a Krylax scout ship lost all targeting capability and began playing lo-fi whale sounds over encrypted channels. Kayla Reese exhaled again, the kind of breath that carried history. She leaned back, stared into the sky, and smiled like someone watching an empire arrive precisely where it wasn't supposed to be. The war hadn't started. It had simply remembered that it was already over. The second assassin never even made it to the front gate. His body, a marvel of synthetic musculature and thought-responsive armor, was later found delicately posed in Kayla Reese's greenhouse, arranged among the orchids like an offering to irony itself. A handwritten note rested on his chest. "Try," again with less eyeliner. Back in the depths of the Krylax flagship Vermilion Sanctum, strategist Noel was developing a visible twitch. "They're not fighting back," he snapped, voice higher than usual. "They're absorbing us, redirecting us. She's eroding our intent." Emperor Kairos, whose patience had once outlasted a neutron star's collapse, was now pacing like a disappointed demigod. "Initiate Wave 2, he ordered, voice reverberating through his crystalline throat plate. "Chrono-marines, psyops linguists, contextual saboteurs, unleash it all." And so they did. Across the stars, the second wave descended on Earth with the silence of dread and the confidence of a people who had never known subtlety. But something went wrong before anything could go wrong. In Buenos Aires, 3 chrono-marines turned on each other mid-deployment, babbling in perfectly accented Shakespearean sonnets. A fleet above New Zealand inexplicably began playing a vintage cooking show on all internal monitors, hosted by a Kyla lookalike who baked lemon tarts while explaining the flaws in Krylaxian dogma. And then there was Seoul, where a gravity distortion field intended to crush a city block was inexplicably repurposed into a kinetic art installation that tourists described as hauntingly sarcastic. Meanwhile, Kayla Reese watered her garden with lavender tea and sang lullabies in a language no human should have known. The flowers began to change. Petals shimmered with subsonic frequencies, humming lullabies that disarmed drones and scrambled biometric locks. Birds nested in the soil, seemingly unaffected. Surveillance picked up an anomaly, a frequency pattern in the shape of Kayla's face blooming across the Imperium's long-range sensors. It didn't attack. It simply smiled. Noel stared at the data and whispered, "She's using passive culture as weaponized context. We've entered a theater of war where the script is in iambic threat pentameter." Across Earth, people kept doing what they were doing. Children laughed under odd-colored skies. Seniors in nursing homes hummed tunes that used to be classified algorithms. In Arkansas, a local bar changed its jukebox settings to only play frequencies that induced introspection in Krylaxian hybrid soldiers. Still, no missiles launched, no plasma exchanged. Kayla sat in a folding chair on her porch, sipping from a chipped mug that read, "World's okayest threat," her expression unreadable. When a cloaked saboteur finally broke into her house, a masterpiece of stealth, phase shifting and timing, he found himself in a kitchen with no doors, only shelves, labeled in a dialect lost to galactic time. The walls began to hum. He dissolved into static mid-scream, leaving behind only a spoon, her spoon, balanced impossibly on its tip. Kairos began unraveling. "This is not war," he barked. "This is humiliation via horticulture." But the humiliation deepened. His most elite ship AI, Vorax 12, began answering commands with passive-aggressive metaphors. A fire control officer reported that their targeting systems had renamed all Earth locations to phrases like, "Nice try Avenue," and "You should call your therapist." Most disturbing of all was the sudden flowering of Kayla's orchids in space, literal blooms sprouting from Kralaxian hulls in orbit, whispering musical notes that bent time slightly enough to make command orders arrive before they were spoken. On Earth, the humans never mobilized. No sirens, no alerts, no meetings, because they didn't need to. Dr. Rina Velasquez, now coordinating planetary defense from the back of a bakery in Prague, adjusted a series of global humidity levels, triggering a wave of sleep across infiltrator synapse networks. She reviewed a document labeled Contingency Foxglove Stage 3, Ambient Rewrite, and chuckled. "They brought swords to a philosophy class," she said. "And Kayla? She's the substitute teacher with tenure and a grudge." Even Noel began to fray. He started carrying around a notebook full of Kayla's intercepted haiku, muttering, "Them in meetings. She's not responding with logic," he mumbled. "She's metabolizing intention, turning our invasion into interpretive failure." Kairos could barely speak without static in his crown's neural interface. He ordered one final attempt, a multispectral neurocollapse strike targeted at Kayla's location. The satellite ignited. The beam began to fire. But what Earth received was a gentle rain of flower petals, scented with something that made entire Kralaxian ships weep uncontrollably. On her porch, Kayla tilted her head, watching the sky change color. "Cute," she murmured. "They think this is escalation." She stood up at last. The earth shifted slightly beneath her bare feet. A ripple of context, of presence, of narrative force echoed outward. The third wave hadn't even been launched yet, but it was already obsolete. Emperor Kairos no longer sat. He throned in a hunched, twitching fury, encased in ceremonial alloys, that now smelled faintly of citrus and defeat. His crown's embedded processors flickered, as if uncertain whether to project his face or Kayla Reese sipping tea. Reports streamed in like doom on fast forward. The second wave was gone. Technically, still existing, but contextually erased, like a punchline with no setup. Ships weren't destroyed. They just stopped remembering their purpose. Entire crews drifted in space, arguing about poetry while their weapons ran real-time simulations of Earth's cooking shows. One dreadnought attempted to fire on Antarctica, only to find its targeting array locked onto the ship's own emotional trauma logs. And yet, Kayla had not left her garden. Not a single official transmission from Earth had been sent. But the message had arrived anyway, painted in symbols, pollens, and quantum glitches in the Kralaxian fleet's navigation subroutines. A flower bloomed in the Admiralty command feed. Its petals formed a phrase in old Terran script. "We're not resisting, we're composting." The Imperium's pride, the Obsidian Lantern, deployed the third wave under cover of blacklight stealth, quantum scissorcraft, psionic lancers, chronometric nullifiers. None returned. A final panicked signal from the strike commander simply said, "The shadows were already taken." Meanwhile, Kayla began planting something new. Blue-laced blooms with geometrically impossible symmetry, humming in rhythmic patterns that resonated with buried Kralaxian fears. She tended them with maternal patience, speaking to the roots in a language no longer spoken, one designed to bypass cognition and sink directly into myth memory. She wasn't attacking. She was reauthoring the story of war itself. Dr. Rina Velasquez, reviewing data from 12 covert satellites disguised as migratory birds, noted a pattern. Kayla's garden was now visible on Kralaxian star maps. Impossible, since they shouldn't have had visual linkage. Somehow their entire cartographic system had accepted Kayla's location as a galactic reference point. "She's become an anchor," Rena murmured. Not a target, a gravitational metaphor. Across Earth, subtle changes unfolded. Streetlights blinked in sequences that triggered hallucinations in enemy agents. Lullabies broadcast over subway intercoms rewrote, coded hate into confused nostalgia. The most secure vaults of the Imperium began to leak historical truths they'd suppressed. Truths that sounded suspiciously like Kayla's bedtime stories. On board the chorus of discipline, strategist Noel sat in the dark, sweating through his chitin. He could no longer remember the strategic language he'd spoken his entire life. It had been replaced with human sarcasm and rhyming limericks. He whispered, "She's winning, not with weapons, but with worldview." A junior tactician cried, "Then what do we fire back with?" Noel closed his second set of eyes and answered, "Shame. But I think they've already disarmed that too." Emperor Kairos, desperate to regain control, attempted direct contact. He broadcast a system-wide message, encrypted with divine authority and dripping with disdain. "Kayla Reese," he thundered, "you stand in defiance of an empire older than your oceans." Her reply arrived as a 60-second video. No title, no fanfare. Just Kayla in her garden, barefoot, leaning slightly against a spade. She smiled softly. "You stand in defiance of irrelevance," she said. "But I get it. You're loud because silence scares you." She stirred her tea with a spoon. The spoon and the Krylaxian fleet's internal alarms all rang at once. No codes, no reason, just spoon. Ships vented their own crews. Targeting systems reclassified every object as not a threat, probably. The Empire's great weapon, the Throne of Final Intent, was rebooted by its own AI with the new designation, Danny. Danny now offered meditation tips and suggested the Emperor try watercolor painting. Krylaxian children began drawing Earth as a mythical creature in school, usually with a cup of tea and a halo of memes. Meanwhile, Kayla walked through a mountain trail not listed on any Earth map. At the summit, an ancient temple awaited, not for prayer, but for resonance. She entered without ceremony, her presence enough to activate systems buried since humanity was pre-industrial. Symbols glowed, algorithms unfolded like petals, and a broadcast began, not one of voice, but of context. Across the stars, Imperium ships buckled, not physically, but narratively. Their reason for existing began to drift, like a subplot forgotten halfway through. Crew members forgot ranks, then motives, then names. They remembered feelings, stories, favorite songs. They remembered Earth not as enemy, but as mirror. That weapon Earth never fired was now in full bloom. Kayla herself, a living paradox designed to make empires question themselves into irrelevance. Emperor Kairos screamed across the void, "End this farce!" But Kayla simply looked at the sky and replied, "I didn't start it. You just walked into your own footnote." And somewhere quietly, the empire began to understand that it hadn't been invaded. It had been edited. It began without sound, not the theatrical silence of a failing weapon or the awkward pause before a diplomatic collapse, but the kind of silence that comes when the story has turned the final page and no one realized they'd been characters all along. Above Earth, the Krylaxian fleet hung like forgotten ornaments, vast, opulent warships now dimmed to a dull glow, their hulls covered in drifting pollen and inexplicably accurate graffiti, quoting Kayla's earliest poems. Some had begun playing lo-fi music with no source. Others had transformed into floating gardens, oxygen scrubbers overridden by an encoded seed algorithm buried inside Kayla's orchids. Emperor Kairos, draped in robes that now itched with metaphor, stood on the final command bridge of the sanctum, Primoris, his voice hoarse from shouting at reflections. No orders worked, no subordinates answered. His crown displayed the weather forecast for rural Wales, and a recurring loop of Kayla slowly stirring tea while jazz played in the background. He ordered one last broadcast, a cry of fury cast into the void. "Face me, Earth. Face me as you are." But Earth did not send soldiers, nor ships, nor declarations. It sent a woman, barefoot, holding a spoon and a teacup. Kayla Reese walked alone through a long-forgotten temple, now alight with the breath of a civilization that never needed approval. Her steps echoed in a rhythm the galaxy had always known, but never named. Outside, the Imperium's sensors detected an anomaly, something small, localized, and impossible to quantify. Kayla had sat down. That was all. She had simply taken her seat on an unremarkable stone slab in the center of an old ceremonial courtyard atop a mountain whose name had been erased from maps a century ago. She set her cup down. The universe bent slightly. A single breath escaped her lips, and every ship in orbit experienced a data bleed. Childhood memories that didn't belong to them, lullabies in unknown tongues, visual hallucinations of Earth's oceans at dusk. Kiros fell to his knees, not from force, but from the unbearable weight of not knowing how to respond. All his weapons had been redefined. His war protocols now opened with motivational affirmations. His palace AI updated its prime directive to protect emotional well-being. Meanwhile, across the Imperium, chaos softened into confusion. Cities began to question why they were cities. Bureaucrats filed reports labeled existential audit. Libraries found themselves restocked with books authored by people who had never existed. Titles like The Art of Losing on Purpose and Fighting with Folded Hands. Back on Earth, no government claimed Kayla. No agency took credit. Because she wasn't a weapon. She was a revelation. A living retcon. And now she was activated. Her final message didn't come as a transmission. It came as a new entry, silently added to the Galactic Conquered archives. A new law, written in Kayla's precise handwriting, titled The Spoon Accord. Clause 1. If you attempt conquest, be prepared for context. Clause 2. Victory will not be granted to those who demand it. Clause 3. We're not at war with you. You're just in our way. The fleets above began to retreat, not because they were forced, but because they could no longer justify their presence. They had lost, not in battle, but in meaning. On the Sanctum Primoris, Kairos stared at the stars, now infected with questions. His last whisper before the throne dimmed was, "What is Earth?" And the throne replied, with Kyla's voice, "An answer you wrote yourself into." Back at her coastal home, Kayla returned to her garden. The air was still, the sky calm, the orchids humming a lullaby only failing empires could hear. She sipped her tea, wiped her spoon clean, and tucked it back into her sleeve like a bookmark in a story that no longer needed reading. Nothing exploded. Nothing ended. But something had finished. And somewhere in the galaxy, a small species, quiet, sarcastic, dangerous in its stillness, resumed its gentle dance around the sun, entirely unbothered by the silence it had authored across the stars.